Welcome back to our viewers. We are now introducing you to a speaker in Australia whose time, I think it's almost 6 a.m. for you, yes?
That's right, yes.
We appreciate your getting this early to make your presentation. It's a privilege to introduce Dr. Melissa Nursey-Bray, Associate Professor, Interim Head of School, Social Sciences and Department of Geography, Environment and Population at the University of Adelaide in South Australia. Trained as a historian, Dr. Nursey-Bray now works as a human geographer and brings the richness of both disciplines to her work in community engagement. Over 20 years of experience with Indigenous populations and communities, natural resource management. Her enduring focus has been on establishing how to engage and support communities to have a voice in and actively participate as members of environmental decision-making policy fora. For the last 10 years, she has also focused on community adaptation to climate change, and in that capacity has led work on the role of knowledge and conflict as drivers in fishing, local government, and Indigenous communities. The title of her talk today is People and the Environment, Engaging Communities in Environmental Decision-Making. Dr. Nursey-Bray, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Hoda, and thank you everyone for attending today. And my apologies that I haven't been able to meet or to see the other presentations. I had high hopes of getting up even earlier than I had, but it didn't work. I also wanted to start this presentation by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country on which I'm giving this talk today, who are the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and their leaders, past, present and future. I wanted to talk to you today about the idea of how communities engage in environmental decision making. And I'm going to be doing that in 4 parts. First of all, I'm going to talk to you about what I think are some of the issues and drivers that motivate or disincentivize communities to become involved in both nature connection and environmental decision making. Then I'd like to go through having a look at, in specific, some of those drivers, but then moving on to looking at some of the solutions, some of the ways forward, and particularly some of the ways forward that you might look at in the context of conflict and conflict resolution. I also wanted to end the session by specifically sharing a case study of some work that I've done over the last 5 years with Indigenous peoples and how they, in different ways and forms, have been addressing the climate challenge in Australia. So obviously my work or my talk is charged with Australian examples, but I think some of those thoughts and reflections, I hope, will have resonance to you over in the US and elsewhere. Fundamentally, different societies and cultures are facing different yet powerful challenges resulting from climate change. And different cultural perspectives definitely inform the cultural palatability of the way in which different communities will respond to and uptake different policy regimes. Now, drawing on some classical allusions, case studies of Australian Indigenous experience, as well as I wanted to talk about the community responses to the recent bushfires in Australia. And I want to argue that the navigation and incorporation of multiple perspectives in climate adaptation provides fertile opportunities for social learning and that resolution of conflict in ways that could perhaps build more peaceful engagement between people and place. Obviously, I'm hoping you're aware of this idea of wicked problems. I tried to talk about the idea of a wicked problem to a New Zealand audience once, but because in their terminology, wicked means absolutely fantastic, didn't have quite the same resonance. But the term wicked problem was coined by Riddle and Weber in 1973. But one of the reasons why I still think it's a useful concept is the sort of idea of the intractability of wicked problems and the ways in which they remain difficult to define, very interdependent and scrambled up with each other, often very unstable, often leading to chronic policy failure, and partly because in terms of leadership, there's so many inputs and so many solutions, but there are also, it's very differentiated, very difficult to put your hand on who is going to have that specific leadership opportunity. So the social complexity of wicked problems remains, I think, a huge dilemma. And in terms of the problems we face today, I guess, some of the big five are things like population, climate change, urbanisation. Oh, okay, yep. I'm just turning my volume down a bit. Does that work a bit better?
Fine.
Okay, good, excellent. Obviously, one of the big climate issues in Australia, or a classic example of a wicked problem, is that of climate change, but most recently exemplified by the bushfires. There have been policy issues, community issues, livelihood issues, and all sorts of related tensions around the bushfires. In many ways, of course, this whole issue in Australia has been totally superseded by engaging with how to manage the corona pandemic. But there is still, many communities in Australia as we speak who are suffering from the post ramifications of the gravity of these fires. The fire, as I said here, the fires. This is not normal, and climate change is causing longer and hotter heat waves, extreme lowering of precipitation, a lot less rain, and of course that's caused a lot of drought. And we've had an extended drought, which has meant that all the vegetation is a lot more flammable. So climate change, I think, and wicked problems are one of the drivers moving towards trying to understand how we have these issues facing us today. I also wanted to talk about what I think is scepticism, which is particularly rife in Australia, a blindness to accepting that something like climate change and major issues are occurring. I want to hark here back to gain inspiration from Cassandra, who, as a Greek princess princess of Troy, sister to Helen, one of the things that happened to her was that she caught the eye of the god Apollo, who, in rejecting his advances, she made very cross. And as a result, at the beginning, he had blessed her with the gift of telling the future, and at the end, he cursed her with the gift of prophecy, but no one believing that what she was saying. And I think people like Will Steffen here in the middle, who is in Australia, one of our most acclaimed climate scientists, who has even sustained death threats for coming out in the public and saying, climate change is an issue. And I think generally speaking, people that are trying to connect to or make the case for nature are very much still, unfortunately, derided, whether it's as a result of ideological reasons or just head in the sand syndrome. But certainly scepticism remains rife as an issue. Another issue, I think, also, harking back to ancient Greek mythology, is the narcissistic and individualist behaviour of societies. Generally speaking, I feel is fueling a vast disconnection across the planet. So ironically, at the moment with the corona, when we're all isolated, connection seems to be being revitalised in some very interesting ways. Narcissus was a hunter in Greek mythology, and one of the things that he was known for was he basically was a very attractive young man, apparently, but he basically fell in love with himself. You can see him gazing into the pond here at himself, and I think one of the issues there in our society is that we are still gazing at ourselves at the expense of all else. Narcissus, of course, basically died from love of himself because he couldn't tear himself away and fell into despair by the riverside. But I think in many cases, I'm arguing that much of our own distress and issues today in terms of connecting communities to the environment comes from a sense of disconnection. And there is, as MacDonald says here, we have a narcissistic society where self-promotion and individuality seem to be essential. Yet in our hearts, that's not what we want. We want to be part of a community. We want to be supported when we're struggling, and we want a sense of belonging. But group narcissism is huge, and the worst thing our collective narcissism is doing to the destruction of the planet is the destruction of the planet. Together, we're wiping out species after species, fueled by consumerism, self-importance, and may destroy us in the end. There's been quite a bit of research around this, talking about how, in particular, children are less connected to the environment, and that this disconnection or extension of experience is, in fact, one of the greatest ecological crises. So before I wanted to, share a poem here, which is about my image of a small boy or girl, basically those dazed eyes that look up unseeing and sharpen, annoyed at being interrupted. Souls that lie flaccid, unprovoked, unasked, not whipped into shape by hard work or keen imaginations. From birth, the smorgasbord of life has been laid out before them, an endless online parade of movement, colour, violence and sex. Our little boys, our little girls, innocence merged into insolence, life's fire into indifferent complacence. Vicarious lives lived through others people's eyes, zombies, zombies all. So for me, a lot of these sort of ideas around what is driving this connection is also connected to technology and the ways in which we become absorbed through it. And finally, we have urban living. We all know that urban living, basically, we have a huge population now. By 2050, we have expecting to have something like 60% of our population living in cities, and it's risen exponentially sixfold from 1950 and between 1950 and 2018. A lot of issues there: air pollution, disease, development of slums, biodiversity loss, and water inequality. All of these are ongoing issues that are causing the type of conflict across the world that we really need to think about. Collectively, they're all being amplified by climate change, and collectively, they all provide a wicked problem that we need to face. And now I want to, set the context for that sets the context for the way in which I wanted to move into the conversation now around taking action. Because one of the key issues around taking action is that the differentiated inequalities that are caused by the combination of climate change and disconnection from nature means that we also need to look at peaceful solutions that are fundamentally underwritten by social justice, so socially just climate solutions. And it's important to think about what are the triggers for that and how can we think about moving forward. One of the ways that I want to advance thinking about this creatively is the idea of paying attention, a reconnection agenda. So, looking backward in terms of the sorts of things I've just discussed, a fundamental disconnection from nature caused by multiple agendas. We really need to look back and say, how do we get people and communities to reconnect? I mean, it's a political issue as much as anything else, because You know, if you can try and get people to pay attention, then they might make electoral demands that would then necessitate governments making some governance policy that will actually be more peaceful and build towards adaptive capacity. One of the works that I'm drawing from is this work by Sitton, who in 2016 wrote a book called The Ecologies of Attention. And Sitton's work really, or what he argues, is that one of the issues around how the world is constructed today is that what we're asked of is we're always asked to have our attention consumed. So we live in a consumption, or what he calls an attention economy. That attention economy means that our attention is always being bombarded, whether it's from video games, from social media, from online shopping, from all sorts of emails. From the minute we wake up in the morning to when we go to bed at night, our attention is consumed. And it's an economy because basically a lot of people are making a lot of money out of our attention. And collectively, he argues that what we actually suffer from is therefore a deficit of attention. We don't have enough attention to give to all the demands that we are being asked to consume, that we don't have room left over to conceptualize our attention in other sort of focused ways, such as towards nature. So he argues that what we need is a shift from an attention economy to paying attention, and that this basically shifts the individualistic nature of how we apportion our attention at the moment to a more collective understanding of looking at nature and looking at attention as an ecology. I think this is a really good way to start thinking about how you might move forward as a framework to building peace. So what does that actually look like? And I want to share that in two parts. I want to talk about paying attention through situated ecologies, and particularly looking at what would that look like in the context of moving to solutions in the context of the bushfires in Australia. And secondly, I wanted to talk a little bit about how Indigenous Australians have already, for millennia in Australia, and I'm talking like 60,000 years, been paying attention to their country and also chart a different form of connection to the environment. So I'm arguing for situated ecologies, which is basically that to be situated in your own environment is to cautiously attend to difference and to take each location and landscape seriously. It's about acknowledging the senses and acknowledging emotion. And it's often a tricky dance because adequately representing the senses and emotions of people, especially since language is so tricky, is a tricky thing. But if you look at some of Henri Lefebvre's work, he talks about the idea of everyday life, the importance of everyday living, where people do have situated everyday routines. And so if we think about paying attention to everyday life, we can rework social ecologies to collaborate and develop collective understanding of what social ecology looks like and how collective social ecological futures can be understood and engaged. But I think that the key to that is that situating ecologies in, say, for example, urban context basically means, you know, people paying attention to the link between ecology and socioeconomic circumstances, because that is the fundamental tension, is trying to reconcile that tension between how we live and the resources that we need to sustain that living. But moving beyond that, to have an ecology of care towards non-human environments. So building adaptive capacity in a climate context, looking towards that is a very important first step. And I've got here a definition of what attributes you might need. So we're looking at things like social learning or a learning capacity, resourcing social actors to be able to respond autonomously to environmental change and to encourage people to positively do that and self-organise themselves. Have the kind of leadership that we need to drive that change and motivate individuals, as well as the resources to do that. And fair governance is an integral part of this because to develop socially just climate solutions, we need to have equitable, legitimate and accountable governance that will work in multiple countries in multiple ways. And diversity or variety is a really important thing. There's no like one stop, one thing will fix everything. But looking at the capacity of different sectors and different communities to respond and build towards managing for change. So for me, part of paying attention and trying to situate yourself within a landscape, wherever that is also will also have the result of building adaptive capacity. So what are some of the ways forward then? And I think one of the sort of suggestions, one of the things that happened early this year, is a lot of people in Australia were asking the question, what do communities do in terms of responding to change? And one of the things that I'd like to discuss is look at the idea of conflict and addressing fear with action. Because when you address fear with action, that's one of the most effective ways to reduce anxiety and to move forward, no matter how small that action is. And I think conflict itself is something that's often given a bad name, and that in fact it's a very transformative concept. So it actually, if you look at adaptive governance or building up adaptive capacity, rather than shying away from conflict, we can look at it as a transformative opportunity that generates opportunity and growth. And one of the quotes I'm quite fond of from Laws is he says, in effect, eliminating conflict will also eliminate potential learning and innovation. A central feature of a complex adaptive system is its agency's abilities to learn from the numerous interactions that are occurring. So this ongoing adjusting is the substance of which conflict is made and which can contribute to collaborative resource management. It's a recognition that conflict is a dynamic process. And also, in fact, Paul's looking at conflict as harnessing the conflict energy, as shooting the rapids, where turbulence within socio-ecological regimes is captured. And what it does is it also enjoins communities to mobilise and galvanise into groups because they have a direct stake in the outcome. So that in fact conflict, in being transformative, can actually enhance the quality of deliberation and decision making. So my argument is that conflict, if it's faced head on, can also have the effect of binding groups together. It can introduce new knowledge and alternative values and worldviews, and it can stimulate learning, creativity, and change. And as Laws finishes off, he says the heat of conflict can contribute to the active engagement of stakeholders who are willing to challenge habits of thought and action, and whose emotion and commitment can inform and sustain a process of moral and practical learning. So that's one of the ways that I think, in terms of addressing conflict, people can productively work together to think about how to do that. So let's look at pragmatic collective action. These are, in many contexts, other ways in which, moving through the resolution of conflict, you can come to some agreements around how we might build towards pragmatic collective action. One of the things that's clear is that actions or collective actions that have social elements can be very helpful. And here's communications about the issue and how to survive the issue are also very important. And I found that a lot of the work that I put into, particularly working with bushfire reference groups earlier on in the year around how to respond to communities around the bushfires, has also had a lot of resonance around how we're now trying to work out how to deal with communities in responding to the coronavirus. So I think, volunteering is obviously a very big part of the success of building community capacity, a willingness to respond, and a sense of community. And in Australia, one of the things that became very evident is that, a huge amount of the actual management of the fires and these national emergencies that we have, it often comes down to our volunteer services, firefighting and other kind of things like that. And volunteering can be a very big part of any community. It builds social learning, but it also provides opportunities for building community cohesiveness across generations. And partnerships, there's some other things there are pretty obvious in terms of like looking at how you might want as communities to get across the nuts and bolts of building from the bottom up sort of management platforms for how you can deal with big issues in terms of climate change. But I think partnerships is a really important one. And I've got this lovely picture here. This is an Indigenous ranger group from New South Wales. And they got trained in conjunction with the local country fire service and the Royal Fire Service to go out and fight the fires. And across Australia, there are in fact over 1,000 rangers across a couple of hundred ranger stations, and they all work together to manage for their land and seas, but also build these sorts of partnerships. And so this is just one example, but there are lots of examples where I think pragmatic collective action through partnerships can not only help in the throes of emergencies, but working towards longer and more enduring peaceful solutions. It creates demand for changes in policy, in requests for resources, and it creates enormous range of alliances. Another numbers of examples that you've got in Australia, we have the Insurance Council of Australia that's openly supporting investments in mitigation. And another example where the National Farmers Federation has joined the Australian Climate Roundtable, which is a broad collection of pro-business lobbyists, trade unions and environmental groups that are seeking well-designed policy to cut the nation's emissions to zero. Out of the recent fires, a specific Farmers for Climate Action has been established, which actually is a wide collective of rural Australians pushing for more action on the effects that climate change is having on agriculture. These types of partnerships all build adaptive capacity into the future, and they lessen that fear and the opportunities for negative conflict, and they assert what are socially just outcomes if undertaken by pragmatic collective actions. Another form of collective action that I think is really important is looking at the ideas of communities of practice. Now, Van der Poel actually calls climate change a problem of many hands, which occurs if there's a gap in a responsibility distribution in a collective setting, and it's morally problematic. And because climate change itself has collective effect and the responsibility for the problem, as with all wicked problems, its solution is widely and often unevenly distributed. The idea of collective action becomes more important. And they basically assert that a group of people can, in terms of communities of practice, come together to have a focus on resource mobilisation, activity coordination and information sharing. Now, communities of practice are a classic example of collective action because they're both formal and informal networks with vertical and horizontal linkages, which span scales and various forms of governance. And what they do is they share particular activities that they practice. They build community identity and they really advance the notion of collective responsibility because different people in different areas will still nonetheless come together in a common practice. Now, I'll just give you some examples in Australia. We have, for example, coast, we have a lot of care groups, land care, coast care, water watch, etc. And they're community volunteer groups made of everyday Australians. Thousands, for example, in Australia, we have over 500 coast care groups who, alongside land care groups, have basically since the early 1990s, late 1980s, have put into action long-term practical solutions in their local areas. And so they've been doing things like plastic pollution, revegetation, all sorts of practices. Other groups are less obvious, but I think worth investing in. You have things like surf lifesaving clubs, urban nature programs, and things like community gardens. In my own state in South Australia, we have over 60 community gardens just within the city region itself, and they all bring together ideas around collective action, climate governance, food security, and community engagement with nature in different ways. So I'm arguing that investing in communities of practice as a deliberative policy process is actually a really good way forward to help build community engagement and investment in environmental making, as well as practically being able to connect back to nature and see how those processes work. Here we've got an example that at a tree planting, actually going out and here's on a field trip having a look at how do these processes work and how do you build towards managing the environment in different ways. I think this is increasingly important also because so many of us live in cities nowadays that finding fora by which we can connect and then remember why we need to pay attention is increasingly important. I also think communicating good news stories is a really important element of creating the elements and dynamics that you need for positive solutions moving forward. In our state, as some of you may know, Kangaroo Island, which is off the state of South Australia, was incredibly battered by the recent fires. And one of the people that the victims in Kangaroo Island really launched this campaign. Dana Mitchell was her name, and they had a goal of $15,000, and they ended up, as you can see, just the other day with $2.5 million. And what they're basically doing is they're returning, and they've now returned dozens of animals, wildlife, back to the environment. And I think one of the things that we need to remember is that in all of these sort of scenarios where people are so impacted, that the nature is also a victim. And in this case in Australia, I estimate over 1 billion animals, wildlife lost their lives. So it's also good to promote good news stories. I think citizen science, which is in a way a little bit picking up on this idea of communities of practice, but citizen science is a very important mode by which people are now enjoining communities to become involved, particularly in programs that are trying to promote understanding and I guess lessen people's scepticism about climate change. In Australia, one of the most sceptical people on the planet are fishing, the fishing sector. And so this program, RedMap, was designed to basically talk to fishers about why and how climate change is affecting the species. All down the eastern seaboard of Australia, we have a number of species who are moving basically from north to south due to warming waters. And this RedMap program, and I was part of this program that didn't run it, that was developed by Professor Greta Petzel from the University of Tasmania. Basically, she asked fishers all across Australia to a spot log map. So go out there, and when they saw an unusual species, they would spot log and map it. and then that's in turn verified by a team of scientists, marine scientists. And this has had a twofold result. Number one, it's built up processes, a data bank in Australia of species being where they shouldn't be, and help scientists understand the impact of climate change. And it's also acted as a very crucial opportunity to raise public awareness in the fishing community about the impacts of climate change, and therefore the palatability of their responses to taking up adaptation options. So those are a wide range of ideas that I've sort of developed over the last couple of years, thinking hard around how do different people and different societies engage with nature, why are they not engaging with nature, and how we might move forward in promoting some of those areas. I think some of the ideas are important because they provide some of the touchstones that I think are fundamental in understanding for societies to try and work towards um, addressing some of the challenges that are offered by capitalist, individualistic, narcissistic imperatives that pretty much drive a lot of the structure and architecture of how we live today. So I want to now take a turn and move into the last part of my talk, which is to look at, I guess, share with you some of the perspectives that I have been privileged enough to learn from working with Indigenous peoples over many years in Australia. And to start that conversation off and to build towards having sharing some ideas on Indigenous perspectives on climate change and some of the solutions that they are leading and pioneering in Australia, it's important for people to understand the idea of country. Now, I want to go back again to that idea of paying attention, because all of these ideas that I'm putting forward are underpinned by the idea that they are fundamental to a reconstitution of how we view the world from an attention economy towards paying attention. Indigenous peoples in Australia, are the oldest in Australia, been in the continent for over 40 to 60,000 years. In some cases, some people are saying there's evidence for 70,000 years across the nation. And one of the things that underpins Indigenous perspectives in Australia, and I just want to make a caveat here, Indigenous peoples in Australia are incredibly diverse. So there are literally hundreds of groups of people, but they all are united in this idea of country. Now, country is basically the significant area of land and sea which constitutes the traditional affiliation to that land. And so Indigenous peoples are in fact the First Nations of the people, and there are, as you can see, many nations. This is a map that's rolled out quite often in Australia by a man called Tyndale. But one of the things that you can see here, that each one of these map or regions actually represent an Indigenous country. And that's why I said you can see here Ghana, that's the Adelaide Plains people, that's where I actually live here, as you can see. And for example, I do a lot of work up here with the Good people. But each one of these peoples have a country, they have a language, they have a law system, and so when Captain Cook rocked up to Australia and decided it was the land of no people, that was clearly a preposterous proposition and simply untrue. So what I wanted to do now is to start. It's important to understand the idea of country before I talk to you about the case study of the group I worked with in Australia on climate change, because you can see here that if you've been a group that's lived in this country for over 40 to 60,000 years, there's a lot of knowledge embodied in each one of these regions, and that knowledge is millennia old knowledge, and there's been a management of this country over years, and so a paying attention, the ultimate paying attention to landscape and to land. And the fundamental thing about the relationship of Indigenous people to the country is that it is inextricably connected. So you are the country is you, and that's an important thing to understand. Now, I want to talk to you here. I have done work across Australia with an Indigenous colleague called Phil Rist, who is in fact a Ngalia man, so he's from this part of the world, nice and tropical. And he and I together worked with Indigenous peoples across Australia to ask some questions around how do Indigenous peoples understand and respond to climate change, and looking forward in terms of that. And I guess part of what I wanted to share with you now is the results um, uh, of that endeavour, because there are some insights there that are important moving forward to how people can pay attention to climate change. But I also think for Indigenous people, one of the reasons why it's very important is because Indigenous peoples in Australia are still disproportionately affected by climate change. And part of that is because they are disproportionately represented in terms of being poorer and suffering from a lot high proportion of disease and socioeconomic circumstances, which consolidate some of those ways in which the impacts of climate change may affect them. But one of the things that we found is that Indigenous peoples across Australia, rather than sort of bowing down and saying, oh, we're vulnerable, have actually come out and led many opportunities and ways of responding to climate change, and they've asserted agency in many ways. So despite climate change posing both direct and indirect threats to the socio-economic, institutional and environmental systems of Indigenous communities in Australia, they've been responding in very convincing ways to the challenges. And you've got to understand those challenges are being addressed at these country by country levels, and some of those issues. So what we did was we basically over 2 years talked to different Indigenous communities about their country and what are the changes that have been attributed to climate change by Indigenous peoples, and then looking at the adaptation initiatives being driven by Indigenous. I wanted to share some of the results of that because, as I said, I think they also show that different cultures, there are multiple different perspectives on how we might peacefully move towards addressing climate change. First of all, Indigenous peoples are actively observing the impacts of climate change. Just for example, here we find, for example, that the bush tucker that used to be flowering at certain times is no longer flowering in those situations. And so there's multiple changes and different signs by which Indigenous people read the landscape are embedded within their knowledge systems. For example, the bottlebrush isn't flowering, the grunters or the fish are not biting, traditional calendars are changing, wattle trees are not flowering, therefore we don't know when the barramundi is running. We also find that Indigenous perspectives on climate technology is very different. And the key thing I wanted to say about that is that Indigenous peoples are worldwide over-constructed as being either resilient or vulnerable. And one of the key things that Indigenous peoples in Australia have said to us is that we are not resilient or vulnerable. That's too binary. What we are is survivors, and we have agency. And the agency that has been asserted across Australia has in fact been amazing. Aboriginal peoples are not passive victims, and a diversity of climate initiatives have been implemented across their countries. Just a few examples here. There have been a series of climate adaptation strategies that Indigenous peoples have developed over time, including the Arabunga climate change strategy and also the Torres Strait strategy, which is right at the very top with the islanders. And across the northern of Australia, we have carbon enterprises where people in the Western Arnhem Land of doing fire abatement projects. And we have outreach and education activities such as the Mirawong Climate Calendar, where they're developing climate adaptation tools using traditional ecological knowledge based on the weather, and climate science projects for the Tiwi Islander peoples, as well as I said, the ranger groups across Australia. Over 1,000 Indigenous rangers are working together to develop plans and explicitly recognise moving forward, managing for their country in terms of climate change. So to end, I wanted to talk about the idea of facilitating that agency and strategic localism. And I suggest that Indigenous peoples have a lot to offer non-Indigenous policymakers in what they do, which is conduct a very strategic local approach, looking at diverse sites and actors that basically assert agency to adapt into climate change in ways that bring together millennia old knowledge with contemporary knowledge and ecological scientific management practices to build towards a practice of adapting to change. And I think the key thing about that, the key lesson, is that it's definitely not a case of one size fits all. We have hundreds of Indigenous countries in Australia and therefore hundreds of different ways in which people are addressing those issues. And so I think the key final message there is that moving towards the future and global solutions, we actually need to look at local place-based responses that co-involve Indigenous peoples and nations wherever we are, and ones that are adequately resourced to support people to make their own changes and to continue to do that in a way that collectively addresses current climate impacts on both country and people. I did want to talk a little bit about agency being also helped along by humour. I think humour, one of the things that we've found across Australia is that humour is a very important part of building agency because it's a coping mechanism. And I'm just ending this presentation with that idea because I think that humour in a time of distress and in a time of what is effectively an enduring long-term emergency like climate change. It doesn't have a spectacular sort of, oh, we've got a hurricane or something. It's the long-term enduring nature of it that's really important. And I think finding ways of using humour within management is another way of building collective responses and connection. And so finally, bringing it all together, I wanted to end with the idea of hope. And again, looking at Greek mythology, the idea of Pandora. Pandora, who was a woman in ancient Greek times who was asked to look after a box and charged not to open it. She did open it, and it let out all of the illnesses and hardships of the world. But at the very end, there was hope. And hope flew out last, but remains also as a very key and important part, I think, of the underpinning idea of paying attention to nature, paying attention to the fact that we do have climate change and moving towards peaceful solutions in a collective, collaborative and very positive way. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nursey-Bray, for that very interesting presentation on community engagement and the environment. I will now turn the time over to Kate, who will then take us through the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So as we have through the day, we have the question and answer box. So if the audience have any questions, they can pop those in the box and I will read them out for you. And then I actually wanted to start with a question too, because I'm taking my prerogative again. I've been doing that all day of asking the first question. And what I wanted to ask is connecting this idea of the individualistic behavior that we see. how can we change people's everyday lives, the way we're living our lives, to change that to be more communitarian rather than so narcissistic?
I think actually one of the interesting things about the coronavirus is that's giving us some tips on how to actually do that. I think spending less time inside and more time outside. I think working together in community groups has a really big impact. I also think education is really important. Like one of the things that struck me over the bushfire season is that I went on a few radio interviews and I always got asked the same question, which is pretty much your question, is what can we do about it? And I think that a lot of people aren't really aware that there is a whole raft of things that we can all do in terms of sustainability initiatives that really do make a difference. So I think, you know, all that sort of stuff, people could carpool more, they could take public transport, they could eat less meat, they could, buy less fast fashion, they could not use plastic, and all of those things collectively will actually help. But I also think it's very important for people not to be frightened about being political and about being out there. And I think a lot of people are these days. I mean, I'm old enough now that, you know, when I was younger, I was a greenie and you could be a greenie and you could have an impact. And now it's like you can be a greenie, but, you can get sued at the same time. And how many people are going to go out there and put themselves on the line when they might end up being sued? So I think that people need to be collectively less frightened so that they can basically provide pressure on the government to actually make change. And when you're in something like the coronavirus crisis, you see people do get cross enough to put pressure on governments, and it does has an impact. And so it's just, if everyone could get as cross about climate change and work together to put political pressure, it would have an amazing effect. So I think not being frightened of being political is something that, as a call to action, is really important as well.
Thank you very much. So the next question comes from the audience, and it starts off with, thank you for a beautiful presentation. You briefly mentioned educational outreach programs for climate change. What are the core components of such programs that can be applied and contextualized at the local level?
In terms of climate change, I think the core elements, I mean, one of the core elements needs to be some sort of governance process that's equitable, that involves all people. I think having at the core of some of those groups, it's very important to have things that are pragmatic and tangible. I think it's really important for people to feel a sense of achievement and that they're doing something and that it's having an impact. And I also think that looking at communications, I didn't talk a lot about it, but I think communications is really important because we're all drenched with communications all the time. A lot of people can't differentiate between what's fake and what's real. And so I think an important part of being a group that's galvanised around the issue of climate change is to have within that group a communicator or someone that's very capable of doing things. So I think I don't think anymore, it's being radical. I think nowadays is not just about saying I'm radical. It's about providing a radical way of doing things and having groups that have a composite of skills that move forward to produce some actions that collectively make people feel they're doing something.
Great, thank you. Another one from the audience, have you seen changes in education policy based on social science understandings of the importance of social ecology in human development? And if not, what do you think would provoke change in this direction?
That's a really interesting question. I find it a bit frustrating because coming from working in the geographical space and currently as interim head of school, like spending so much of my time trying to work out how to get students into the courses, I still find it gobsmacking that educationally everyone's not like champing at the bit to go and do geography and learn how to save the planet, you know. So I think it's a really important question, that one, is how do we incentivise people to do that? So I guess part of my answer to that question is that I don't think as yet social science has really had its day. I think still a lot of people rely heavily on scientific perspectives as the modus operandi for fixing these problems. Whereas in fact, you can have the best science in the world, but people will get in the way. So you do need social science. And I think my work with Indigenous people is really it charts one way in which I guess social science can be really powerful, because the cultural knowledge that's embodied in a lot of Indigenous peoples, but it's not just the knowledge, it's the perspective on life. And the perspective on life is fundamentally about an understanding that the social ecological relationship is the one that matters. And so I think bringing in understanding of lots of different cultural perspectives is a big part of the social science challenge moving forward. And I think it's a little bit like climate change, like sometimes, in order to get what you want, you need to call it something else. And so, I think moving towards discussions around how to engage people on the planet and move towards building those social solutions needs a discussion that's quite differentiated, so that people can understand what you're saying, but maybe you have to speak a bit of their language in order to get that message across.
Great, thank you. And then another one from the audience. This is in two parts. So the first part of the question is, you were talking about paying attention and engaging our community in climate change. So how important is reconnecting with the natural world, spending time in nature, in understanding and solving climate change? And then building off of that, as members of our communities, what would be your biggest encouragement for us to take action to bring about climate reform in our communities, even if it's just at the local level?
Okay, so what was the first bit? Sorry, that was a long question.
Sorry, so how important is actually spending time in nature in understanding and solving climate change?
Yeah, I think spending time in nature is crucial because I think, it's not just me, there's a whole literature that shows how connection to nature, or just actually experiencing nature, makes a huge difference in how people act and behave. But also it makes a huge difference in terms of their receptivity to particular policies and things like that. So say when you're going through an election period and, someone says, I'm going to promote this climate policy, that you're more likely to be responsive to it. I think tourism probably has a role to play in helping people go out in nature and say, as well, this is what's happening. But one of the things about citizen science is that it can often get people out in nature in a structured way, but it also says, okay, well, have a look at this. Isn't this beautiful? Enjoy having a walk on this coastline. But while we're here, have you noticed that sea level rise is affecting this coastline, and it's affecting these particular dimensions? So I think actively encouraging people to get out in nature is important. And the other reason why it's important is because this whole area can be very emotionally distressing. And one thing that happens when people are very emotionally distressed is they switch off. So it's about turning the on button, making the on button work for people, so that they want to save and protect something, rather than instead of just looking at all the disasters where it turns them off. It's about saying these are some of the reasons why you should do it. And I think in terms of the second part of the question was about what we do at local levels, was it? Yeah. So I think what we do at local levels is that you do that, like with your children, you take them out and you get them involved, and rather than always, wanting to take the trip to, Europe, maybe you actually go on in Australia, for example, or Bali, maybe you actually go and, take what we call staycations. So, you stay at home and you have a holiday, and you visit beautiful places in your own environment. The second thing I think is really important for people to do locally is to engage with the environment in urban context, because go to the parks, advocate for recreational green spaces, plant trees in your garden that are going to attract birds. They're simple things, but they all add up. It's that idea of the everyday life. They all add up, because then people get simple pleasure out of something that then, ultimately produces an incentive to create, or move towards a better world. And I mean, even now in the middle of the coronavirus, you have people saying, wow, the air quality in Adelaide's so much better. Oh, look, you can actually see the bottom of the water in Venice. People can breathe in cities in China because there's not the same amount of pollution. And it's not the time to be going out in the media and talking about this stuff, because everyone's dealing with unemployment and stuff like that. But the reality still is that if you've got time to pay attention and notice, it actually makes a difference to the quality of life. And if people think of their kids and expose their kids to it as well, that's also shown that children that are exposed to nature, it's been shown that they are more mentally conscious, and have a different perspective later on in life.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're out of time, but thank you very much again for your presentation, and also for getting up so early to join us. We really appreciate it. I'm going to pass it back over to Professor Mahmoodi now, who'll just have some closing remarks, and then that will be it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My thanks also to Dr. Barney, to Dr. Nursey-Bray for that beautiful presentation. The sensitivity and I suppose the aesthetic nature of her presentation is really something that we should pay attention to in relation to our interactions and relationships with the environment.